Story 1. The Shadow in the Window. Rachel tried to move on from the incident with the figure on her fire escape. She began staying up later, convinced that if she just kept herself occupied, she could shake the unsettling feeling. She bought new locks, even installed security cameras, but nothing helped the growing anxiety that gnawed at her every night. Each evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the sensation returned, a creeping awareness that she was being watched. It got worse. She'd hear faint noises outside, soft tapping, like fingers brushing against glass, always just outside her window. One evening, Rachel decided to review the footage from her security cameras. Most nights were uneventful, showing nothing but empty streets and the occasional car. But when she played back the footage from the night she had seen the shadow, something made her blood run cold. At exactly 3:17 a.m., the camera pointed at her fire escape glitched. For a split second, the image flickered, but it wasn't just static. In that brief moment, she saw something in the footage. A figure, the same shadowy silhouette she had seen outside her window. But in the next frame, it was gone. Rachel froze. There was no way someone could have stood there without triggering the camera again. She replayed the footage several times, her skin crawling. When she looked closer, she noticed something even more terrifying. The figure wasn't standing on the fire escape. It was hovering, suspended just inches above the metal railing, its form flickering in and out of view like a malfunctioning hologram. Panicking, Rachel contacted the police again, but without any physical evidence, they dismissed her concerns. Exhausted and frightened, she tried to reason with herself. Maybe the camera had malfunctioned. Maybe it was all in her head. But deep down, she knew something wasn't right. A few nights later, it happened again. The tapping returned, louder this time, more insistent. But instead of coming from the window, it echoed from inside her apartment. She darted out of bed, heart racing, scanning the room. The tapping seemed to be coming from her closet. Trembling, Rachel approached the door. Just as she reached for the handle, the sound stopped. Slowly, she opened the door, and what she saw made her scream. Inside, scrawled on the back wall in what looked like black soot, were the words, "I'm still watching." She immediately ran out of the apartment, calling the police. But when they arrived, the writing had disappeared, leaving Rachel with no proof. She moved out the next day, but even now, in her new apartment, she sometimes wakes up in the middle of the night, convinced she hears the faintest tapping on the windows. Story 2. The Whispering Woods. Tom couldn't shake the eerie events that unfolded in the forest that night. For weeks, he and his friends avoided talking about it, each trying to pretend the whispers were just a shared hallucination brought on by exhaustion. But as time passed, they started noticing strange, unexplainable occurrences. Tom's friend Jason was the first to report that the whispering had followed him home. He would hear it late at night, just as he was about to fall asleep. Soft, barely perceptible voices murmuring in a language he didn't understand. Jason brushed it off at first, thinking it was his imagination, but then it got worse. One night, as he lay in bed, he felt the unmistakable sensation of someone sitting on the edge of his mattress. He shot up, turning on the light, but no one was there. The whispers, however, grew louder, as if they were just outside his bedroom window. Terrified, Jason didn't sleep that night, and by morning, he had dark circles under his eyes and a haunted look on his face. Tom, too, started having strange experiences. It began with subtle things. Objects in his house moving from their usual places, doors that he was certain he had locked being found ajar. Then came the nightmares. Every night, he dreamt of the forest, of dark figures watching him from the trees, their whispering voices growing louder and more distinct. In his dreams, the figures always seemed to be getting closer, and each time he woke up, he could still hear the faint echo of their voices in his ears. Disturbed by the persistent phenomena, Tom decided to return to the woods, hoping that confronting whatever was there might bring him peace. He brought a group of friends, including Jason, back to the campsite. But this time, something felt different. The air was heavy, oppressive, as if the woods themselves were alive and watching them. As they explored the area, they stumbled upon something they hadn't seen during their first trip. An old, weathered stone circle hidden deep in the forest, covered in moss and surrounded by gnarled trees. In the center of the circle lay a small mound of earth, and as they approached, the whispering returned, louder than ever. It was as if the earth itself was speaking to them. Suddenly, the ground beneath the mound began to shift, and a decayed, skeletal hand broke through the soil. The group screamed and ran, but the whispers chased them, growing louder and more frantic. They barely made it back to their car, and when they looked back, they saw figures standing at the edge of the woods, their faces obscured by darkness. Tom and his friends never spoke of what happened that night, but the whispers followed them for years, always just out of reach, always reminding them of the spirits they had disturbed. Story 3. The Phantom Hitchhiker. After Mark's second encounter with the Phantom Hitchhiker, he couldn't shake the feeling that she had attached herself to him somehow, like a curse. Over the following weeks, he started experiencing bizarre phenomena around his home. Electronics would turn on and off by themselves, the TV flickering static in the middle of the night. His car radio would change stations on its own, always landing on static, no matter how many times he adjusted it. One night, as he drove home from work, the familiar chill returned. He glanced at his rearview mirror and nearly swerved off the road. The woman was sitting in the back seat again, her white dress tattered, her face pale and ghostly. This time, however, she spoke. Her voice was a faint whisper, barely audible over the sound of the engine. "Help me," she said. Mark's heart raced as he struggled to stay on the road. He couldn't respond. His throat was dry, his hands trembling. She spoke again. "You have to help me." Mark pulled over, his hands shaking as he gripped the steering wheel. He whipped around, but once again, she was gone. Panting, he sat in silence, trying to understand what was happening. Why was she haunting him? What did she want? Determined to find answers, Mark began researching the stretch of road where he had first encountered the phantom. He discovered an old newspaper article from decades ago about a young woman who had gone missing after her car broke down on that very road. Witnesses claimed to have seen her hitchhiking before she disappeared, but she was never found. Some locals believed her spirit lingered, searching for someone who could help her. Mark, desperate to end the haunting, decided to revisit the road where he had picked her up. He drove to the spot late one night, parked the car, and waited. Hours passed, and nothing happened. Just as he was about to give up, the temperature in the car dropped dramatically. He looked in the rearview mirror, and there she was, sitting in the back seat. This time, Mark didn't panic. Instead, he calmly asked, "What do you need? How can I help you?" The woman's reflection in the mirror slowly raised her head, and for the first time, Mark could see her eyes, hollow, empty, yet filled with sorrow. "Find me," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Mark spent the next several months searching the woods near the road, convinced that her remains were hidden there. Finally, after extensive searching, a team of local investigators uncovered a shallow grave near where her car had broken down. The remains were identified as the missing woman from decades ago. After her body was found and laid to rest, Mark never saw her again. The haunting stopped, but every time he drives that road, he can't help but glance in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see her one last time.